In the New Testament, we find the story of Jesus' birth in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, and only in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Mark doesn't mention the birth, and neither does John. And Matthew and Luke, if you put them alongside one another, they're really, really different from one another. So Matthew, for example, has extended dialogue between Joseph and an angel, not extended dialogue, but the angel talks to Joseph about, Jesus' mother Mary is pregnant and it's not Joseph's baby. So what's going on here? And the angel comes to Joseph and reassures him that everything is fine and that he shouldn't be afraid to take Mary as his wife. Whereas in Luke, that communication from the angel happens with Mary and not Joseph. So there's a kind of difference in focus of characters. But there's also a lot of narrative differences and chronological differences. So Matthew and Luke both, for example, have Jesus being born in Bethlehem. And this is every Christmas pageant you've ever been to takes place in Bethlehem, right? But in Matthew, Jesus is born in Bethlehem because Joseph and Mary, his parents, live there, and that's a legitimate reason for him to be born there. But in Luke, he's born in Bethlehem for a much more complicated reason. In Luke, Joseph and Mary live in Nazareth, which is a city in the north, and they travel to Bethlehem in order to register in a census, because this is where Joseph's family is from. So Matthew has Jesus born in Bethlehem because that's where they live, and Luke has Jesus born in Bethlehem because they're on the road and they're traveling. Okay, but Matthew also has this strange detail of after Jesus is born, there are Magi, wise men who come to visit him in Bethlehem, and they bring him these gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. That detail's not in Luke. Luke has visitors coming to Jesus, but they're shepherds and not mysterious Magi. And then Matthew also has the detail of the Christmas star, the star that leads the Magi to Bethlehem, as well as Joseph and Mary having to take Jesus to Egypt in order to save him from Herod, who is trying to kill him. So two really, really different stories, And when you combine these stories, you get something close to what people imagine in their nativity scenes, those things that you set up in your front yard or on your mantelpiece. In Matthew and Luke, then, we find two very different portraits, two very different understandings of who Jesus was. And this is the whole point of why Matthew and Luke are telling their stories. They're telling their stories to get readers to see Jesus in a certain light. So Matthew, for example, has Jesus visited by the Magi, these people who bring really expensive gifts. And, this kind of signifies that Jesus is a kind of kingly figure. We gather this also from Matthew's genealogy of Jesus that he begins his gospel with, where Jesus is descended from King David and all of these other very prominent characters. And so for Matthew, Jesus is a kingly kind of royal figure. Whereas in Luke, you still have Jesus being visited, but Luke doesn't have Jesus being visited by the Magi, the wise men. Luke has Jesus being visited by shepherds. And they don't come to a house, they come to some location that we're not really sure. We often assume in Luke, or readers often assume, that Jesus is born in a stable in Luke. And this detail actually isn't in the Gospel of Luke, but Luke does have a detail of Mary putting Jesus into a feeding trough after he's born, into a manger. And so when readers are trying to kind of fill in the gaps of, what did this look like? Where would you find a feeding trough? Well, you'd usually find a feeding trough in a stable. So they kind of fill in that detail. Okay, so two very different understandings of Jesus's birth. So in the years after Matthew and Luke start to circulate, something really interesting happens. People read these texts and they start thinking about these texts, and then they start noticing not only the details that are present in the text, but they start noticing some of the things that aren't present in the text. So, for example, in Matthew's gospel, when the Magi come to see Jesus, Matthew says that they come to see Jesus. They come from the east and they go to Jerusalem, right, and all of those. But Matthew never really tells his readers, why exactly are the Magi interested in Jesus? We're told that they want to pay homage to him or bow before him or worship him, but we're not really told exactly why. Who are they? Where do they come from? Matthew says they come from the east. So that's a big area, right? And so where does Matthew imagine that they're coming from? And he doesn't really go into any detail. He doesn't provide that for us. Luke is kind of the same way, right? When we talk about where exactly is Jesus born in Luke, Luke doesn't mention a stable. So that's something that the readers kind of supply on their own. But then other ancient readers start thinking, well, where else could this have been? So in the years after Matthew and Luke are starting to gain more and more popularity, or, as these stories are just circulating on their own, there are a whole bunch of texts that start popping up, and we call these texts collectively Christian apocryphal literature or Christian apocrypha. And there's a genre of Christian apocrypha called the infancy gospels. And the infancy gospels are stories that, quite frankly, try to fill in those gaps and try to answer those questions that Matthew and Luke don't answer. And there's all sorts of other types of Christian apocrypha. We're interested today in the infancy gospels. But there's a very influential infancy gospel called the proto-gospel of James, or the proto-evangelium of James. And this particular text is very, very popular. It's probably written in the latter half of the 2nd century. So not all that long after Matthew and Luke. And it's very clearly drawing from material in Matthew and Luke. The central focus, the chief focus of the proto-gospel of James is actually not Jesus. Jesus is there, he's a character, but he appears toward the end. The central focus of the proto-gospel of James is actually Jesus's mother, Mary. And the proto-gospel of James starts before Mary's birth with her parents, who are named Anna and Joachim, and it tells about the story of her conception, tells about the stories of her childhood, where she grew up, and all of these other details. Really, really interesting text. And when we ask the question of why would somebody write a text like this? Why would somebody write a short biography of Mary? And the proto-gospel of James is very short. You can read it in an hour. So why would somebody write a story like this? Well, one way of thinking about it is that when people are reading the stories of Jesus's birth in Matthew and Luke, one of the things that they're asking is, who was this person Mary? What was she like? If Matthew and Luke are portraying Jesus as God or something, then certainly his mother must have been somebody pretty spectacular. And so the author of the proto-gospel of James tries to kind of give her a backstory. What was Mary like? This is the type of person that Mary was. So in the proto-gospel of James, you have a collection of stories about Mary. I'll only talk about a few. One of those is the story of Mary's conception before she was born. And her parents, Anna and Joachim, are sad that they don't have a child. And so Joachim goes off to the desert to pray. Anna prays at home. And then miraculously, Anna conceives Mary and she becomes pregnant with Mary. And this text seems to imply that this happens while Joachim is away. And so the proto-gospel of James depicts the conception of Mary itself as a kind of divine conception. There's also a story in the proto-gospel of Mary walking across the room to her mother when she's 6 months old, and her mother scoops her up off the ground and says, you're a special kid. Your feet are never going to touch the ground again as long as you're here. She builds a sanctuary for her in her bedroom. It's really, really fascinating. And then where does Mary grow up? In the proto-gospel of James, they bring her to the temple, and they bring her to the temple when she's 3 years old, temple in Jerusalem. And from the time that she's 3 until the time that she's 12, in this text, she lives in the Holy of Holies. She lives in this kind of holiest spot within the Jerusalem temple. Okay, and so this text is trying to kind of fill in that gap, this big character gap of we don't know anything about Mary from Matthew and Luke, and we don't really know much about her from elsewhere in the New Testament either. And so an author like the one who is responsible for the proto-gospel of James is trying to help us to understand more about who she was, or who she may have been, is maybe a better way of framing that.